They locked me out of my own home that morning. The metal key I had carried for 37 years no longer fit the lock they had secretly changed. I stood there on the cracked concrete stoop of our Brooklyn apartment building, watching the sunrise paint the dirty windows gold while my heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Eleanor, and at 72 years old, I thought I knew what betrayal felt like. I was wrong. Nothing could have prepared me for the morning I discovered my own children had changed the locks while I slept at my friend's house, recovering from what they called one of my episodes. The note they left was crisp, businesslike, typed on my daughter's company letterhead. "Mom, we think it's best if you find somewhere else to stay. The apartment needs to be prepared for sale. We'll be in touch soon." I clutched that faded photograph of Harold and me from our honeymoon in 1975. We were standing on Coney Island, his arm wrapped around my waist, both of us laughing at something the photographer had said. Harold's cologne still lingered faintly on his old shirts that I kept in my closet, but even that comfort had been stripped away now. The morning air bit through my thin cardigan, the same one I'd worn to his funeral 3 years ago, and I realized I was shivering not from the cold, but from the shock of how quickly love could turn into calculation. The sounds of New York morning surrounded me like they had every day for 4 decades. The rumble of delivery trucks, the distant hiss of steam from manholes, the chatter of neighbors heading to work, the familiar ding of the bodega's cash register downstairs where Mr. Chen always saved me the day-old pastries. But today, these sounds felt hollow, like they belonged to someone else's life. I was homeless in the city I had helped build with my own calloused hands, working double shifts at the textile factory while Harold drove his taxi 16 hours a day, so we could afford this tiny one-bedroom apartment that our children now considered prime real estate. I remember sitting there on those cold steps, watching people rush past me like I was invisible, thinking about the woman I used to be. I was Eleanor Hartman, the woman who had sewn Halloween costumes until 2 in the morning because store-bought was too expensive. I was the woman who had stood in line for government cheese during the hardest winters and made it taste like gourmet meals with nothing but love and creativity. I was the woman who had worked 2 jobs so my son Michael could get his business degree and my daughter Sarah could become the lawyer she'd always dreamed of being. But somewhere along the way, I had become just Eleanor, the burden, the elderly mother who asked too many questions about grandchildren's report cards. The woman whose phone calls went straight to voicemail because everyone was too busy building the lives I had sacrificed everything to give them. The mother whose medical appointments were inconvenient, whose loneliness was dramatic, whose needs were somehow always too much. The apartment building's front door opened behind me, and I heard Mrs. Morales from 3B clearing her throat gently. Carmen Morales, 75 years old, retired from teaching elementary school for 43 years, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and silver hair always perfectly pinned into a bun. She was carrying a thermos of coffee and a paper bag that smelled like her homemade empanadas. "Mija," she said softly, her voice carrying just a trace of her Puerto Rican accent even after 5 decades in New York. "You've been sitting here for 2 hours. Come." She didn't ask questions, didn't pry, just sat beside me on those unforgiving steps and poured steaming coffee into a small cup. The warmth spread through my frozen fingers, and for the first time in months, someone was taking care of me instead of the other way around. That morning, Carmen became my lifeline. She listened as I told her about the changed locks, the note, the decades of feeling like I was slowly disappearing from my own family's story. She held my hand when I cried, really cried, for the first time since Harold's funeral. And when I was done, she looked me straight in the eye and said something that would change everything. "Eleanor, when someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. Your children have shown you exactly how much you matter to them. Now you get to decide how much you matter to yourself." The story I'm about to tell you spans 6 months that felt like 6 years and 6 lifetimes all at once. It's about discovering that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you most are the ones who hurt you deepest. It's about learning that respect isn't something you can earn through service, and love isn't something you can buy with sacrifice. Most of all, It's about the morning I boarded a 7 a.m. bus when the driver looked me in the eye and said, "Exit quietly, ma'am," and how that quiet exit led me to a $2 million beach house I never dreamed I could afford. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start with the sacrifices, because that's where all the best and worst stories begin. I gave them everything. Every paycheck, every weekend, every holiday, every moment of strength I had left in my aging body. For 47 years, I had been the mother who said yes. Yes to babysitting while they went on date nights that turned into weekend trips. Yes to co-signing loans for cars and houses and business ventures that never quite worked out. Yes to lending money I didn't have for emergencies that seemed to happen every other month. Yes to moving in with Sarah's family when Harold died, even though it meant giving up the little house we had finally managed to buy in Queens. Michael was 38, married to Jennifer, father to my twin grandsons Tyler and Trevor. He had used my life insurance payout from Harold's death, money I had trusted him to invest wisely, to start a consulting business that folded within 18 months. Jennifer worked part-time at a boutique in Manhattan, spending more on designer handbags than I had ever spent on groceries in a year. The boys were 12 now, more interested in their video games than in their grandmother who used to read them bedtime stories and teach them to make paper airplanes that actually flew. Sarah was 41, married to David, mother to my granddaughter Emma, who was 16 and beautiful and distant in that way, teenagers perfect like an art form. Sarah's law practice was successful. Her Tudor-style house in Westchester County was featured in a home design magazine, and her dinner parties were legendary among her circle of friends, who all seemed to have forgotten that success without compassion is just expensive emptiness. David managed investment portfolios for wealthy clients, and together they had built a life that looked perfect from the outside, if you didn't look too closely at the coldness that had replaced warmth in their daily interactions. I had moved in with Sarah's family believing I was needed. Emma was going through typical teenage troubles. Sarah was working 60-hour weeks. David traveled frequently for business. "Mom, it would be such a help if you could be there for Emma," Sarah had said. And I had packed my few remaining belongings, sold the Queen's house, and moved into their guest room, which had been converted from David's home office with barely concealed resentment. My days began at 5:30 a.m. I would make coffee for Sarah and David, pack Emma's lunch, clean up after breakfast, do the laundry, grocery shopping, meal preparation. I would wait for Emma to come home from school, trying to engage her in conversation about her day, her friends, her dreams. She would nod politely and disappear into her room. Sarah would come home exhausted and stressed, grateful for the hot meal waiting for her, but too tired to do more than eat in silence while scrolling through her phone. David would arrive later, pour himself a drink, and retreat to his study to continue working. Weekends were worse. They were busy with tennis lessons for Emma, dinner parties with colleagues, charity galas that raised thousands for causes they never discussed at home. I was the live-in babysitter, the invisible maid, the woman who made their busy lives possible while becoming increasingly invisible in my own. I remember one particular evening in March, about 6 months before the morning with the changed locks. Emma had a school play, and I had spent weeks helping her memorize her lines, driving her to rehearsals, sewing sequins onto her costume late into the night when my arthritis made each stitch feel like a small knife cutting through my knuckles. The night of the performance, I sat in the third row, beaming with pride as she delivered her lines flawlessly. Afterward, at the reception in the school cafeteria, I overheard Emma talking to her friends. "Yeah, my grandmother lives with us," she said with that particular teenage tone that can make even neutral words sound like an apology. "She doesn't have anywhere else to go." The words hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't a beloved family member. I was homeless charity case they had taken in out of obligation. That night, I lay in the converted office that served as my bedroom, surrounded by boxes of my belongings they never quite found space for, and I started to do something dangerous. I started to add up the costs. Not just the financial costs, though those were staggering. In the 3 years since Harold's death, I had given Michael and Sarah over $85,000. Harold's life insurance payout, my modest retirement savings, the proceeds from selling our house in Queens, monthly contributions from my Social Security checks, that left me buying generic medications and skipping meals to make ends meet. But the emotional costs were even higher. I had given up my independence, my friends, my routines, my sense of home. I had become a ghost in someone else's house, grateful for scraps of attention, apologetic for taking up space, invisible except when there was work to be done or money to be given. The breaking point came gradually, then all at once, the way heartbreak often does. It started with small things. My calls to Michael that went straight to voicemail. Sarah's increasing impatience with my questions about family plans, social events, holiday arrangements. Emma's embarrassment when her friends saw me picking her up from school. David's pointed comments about groceries being expensive and electricity bills being high, as if my presence was a costly inconvenience they were magnanimously bearing. My 69th birthday passed unnoticed. I woke up that October morning hoping someone would remember, would do something special, would show me that I still mattered. Sarah left for work early without her usual goodbye. David was already gone. Emma was rushing to catch the school bus. By evening, when no one had mentioned it, I realized they had all genuinely forgotten. Not maliciously, not cruelly, but completely. The woman who had never forgotten a birthday, anniversary, graduation, or milestone in their lives had become so forgettable that her own birth was invisible. I bought myself a small cake from the bakery section at the grocery store. I lit a single candle in my room and made a wish I had never thought I would need to make. I wished for someone to see me, really see me, as more than a burden or a bank account. Then came the winter when I got pneumonia. It started as what Sarah dismissed as just a cold. But at 70, just colds can become dangerous quickly. I spent 3 days barely able to get out of bed, running a fever that made me delirious, coughing so hard I thought my ribs might crack. I called Sarah at work, my voice barely a whisper. "Mom, I'm in the middle of a deposition. Can this wait? I think I need to go to the hospital." I managed. "Just take some medicine and rest. I'll check on you tonight." She didn't check on me that night, or the next night. David found me collapsed on the bathroom floor on the third day, and only then did they take me to the emergency room, where doctors said I was dangerously dehydrated and could have died if I had waited much longer. During my 4-day hospital stay, Sarah visited once for 20 minutes between client meetings. Michael didn't come at all, though he sent flowers with a card that said, "Feel better soon. Love Michael and Jennifer and the boys." Emma came twice, both times looking uncomfortable and checking her phone constantly. They brought me home to an empty house. Everyone was too busy to take time off work or school to help me recover, and left me with a bottle of antibiotics and instructions to call if I needed anything. I lay in that converted office, weak and dizzy and frightened, and realized that if I died, it might be days before anyone noticed. The realization wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, settling into my bones like winter cold. The understanding that I had become so unimportant in their daily lives that my absence might be a relief rather than a loss. Spring brought new betrayals, smaller ones that accumulated like cuts from paper, each one insignificant alone, but together creating wounds that wouldn't heal. There was the Mother's Day when Emma gave me a generic card she had clearly picked up at the school store that morning, while Sarah and David spent the day at a spa weekend they had forgotten to mention. There was the graduation party for the twins, my grandsons whom I had helped raise, where I learned about it from a Facebook post and wasn't invited because "We thought you'd be tired, Grandma, and it was going to be really loud." There were the medical appointments I attended alone because everyone was too busy, the prescription medications I couldn't afford because my contributions to their household expenses left me choosing between pills and food. The nights I lay awake listening to them laughing downstairs at dinner parties I wasn't included in, serving food I had prepared but wasn't invited to enjoy. But the cruelest cut came from what I discovered by accident on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in June. I was cleaning Sarah's office, a task I had taken on without being asked, the way I had taken on so many tasks in their house, when I knocked over a stack of papers near her computer. As I gathered them up, I saw my name on several documents. Confused, I looked more carefully. There were real estate assessments for the apartment building where I had lived with Harold, bank statements showing transactions I didn't understand, legal documents with language I couldn't fully comprehend, but that clearly involved my name and Harold's estate. My hands shaking, I took photos of the documents with the old smartphone Michael had given me for emergencies. That evening, I called Mrs. Morales, who had remained a friend even after I moved to Westchester, and asked if her nephew Luis, who worked as a paralegal, could look at something for me. What Luis discovered broke my heart and changed everything. Sarah and Michael had been using my identity and Harold's estate to secure loans and investments I had never agreed to. The apartment building we had owned in Brooklyn, the one Harold and I had scrimped and saved to buy as our retirement security, had been sold without my knowledge, with Sarah as my financial power of attorney, on documents I had never signed. The proceeds had been invested in a cryptocurrency portfolio that had lost 60% of its value, and the rest had been used as collateral for loans that were now in default. I was not just homeless by their choice. I was financially ruined by their deception. The money I thought I was giving them freely had actually been stolen from me systematically, legally, through paperwork. I was too trusting and too tired to read carefully when Harold was dying, and I was drowning in grief. The night I learned this truth, I sat in their perfect guest room surrounded by their perfect things, bought with my stolen money, and I cried harder than I had cried since Harold's funeral. But these tears were different. They weren't just tears of sadness. They were tears of rage, of betrayal, of the terrible clarity that comes when you finally see people you love for who they really are, instead of who you needed them to be. Carmen Morales took the photos of the documents to Luis. Luis took them to a lawyer who specialized in elder financial abuse. The lawyer, Margaret Chen, no relation to my bodega friend but equally kind, explained that what my children had done wasn't just cruel, it was criminal. She also explained that pursuing legal action would be expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally devastating, with no guarantee of recovering what had been stolen. "Mrs. Hartman," she said gently, "you have to decide what you want more, justice or peace. Sometimes you can't have both." That night I made a decision that would have seemed impossible to the woman I had been just 6 months earlier. I decided I wanted peace, but not the kind of peace that comes from accepting abuse and calling it love. The kind of peace that comes from walking away from people who see your kindness as weakness and your love as a resource to be exploited. I started planning my escape. The irony wasn't lost on me that as a woman who had never planned anything more complicated than a week's worth of meals, I was now plotting to disappear from the lives of people who had made it clear I was unwanted anyway. But planning gave me something I hadn't had in years: a sense of agency, of control over my own story. Carmen became my secret co-conspirator. She helped me open a new bank account at a branch where my children weren't known. She drove me to appointments with social services, where I learned about resources for seniors that I had never known existed. She held my hand while I made phone calls to old friends I hadn't spoken to in years because I'd been too busy serving my children's lives to maintain my own relationships. The hardest part was pretending everything was normal while I gathered the pieces of my life they hadn't managed to steal or destroy. My few pieces of good jewelry that had belonged to Harold's mother, still hidden in the bottom of my purse from a time when I had been paranoid about house burglaries. An old bank account Harold and I had opened years ago for emergencies that they had never known about because it was at a small community bank in Queens. The Social Security checks that came directly to me, which I began depositing in my secret account instead of turning over to Sarah for household expenses. I also discovered, with Carmen's help, that Harold had been more financially savvy than I had ever realized. There were small investments, bonds, savings accounts scattered across different banks, Depression-era habits he had learned from his father about not keeping all your eggs in one basket. My children had found and looted the obvious accounts, but there were others, older ones with matured interest, forgotten accounts that had been growing quietly for decades. When I added it all up, I had almost $300,000 they didn't know about. Not a fortune by Manhattan standards, but enough to buy independence. Enough to start over. Enough to choose dignity over dependency. The morning they locked me out was actually the morning I had been planning to leave anyway. I had rented a small furnished apartment in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, closer to Carmen and the life I was ready to rebuild. My few belongings, the ones that actually mattered, were already packed and stored at Carmen's apartment. The only things left in their guest room were clothes I rarely wore, and books I had been too sentimental to throw away, but didn't need to carry into my new life. When I found the changed locks and read their dismissive note, my first emotion wasn't devastation. It was relief. They had made the choice for me. I no longer had to feel guilty about leaving them. I no longer had to wonder if I was overreacting or being unfair. They had shown me, with crystal clarity, exactly how much I meant to them. Sitting on those steps with Carmen, sharing coffee and empanadas while I told her about the locks and the note, I felt something I had forgotten existed. Anticipation for the future, instead of dread of each new day. "So what now, mija?" Carmen asked. I looked at the photograph of Harold and me at Coney Island, both of us so young, so confident that love and hard work would be enough to build a beautiful life. We had been right about the love and the hard work. We had just been wrong about who would value what we built together. "Now," I said, tucking the photograph back into my purse, "I'm going to live the life Harold and I dreamed about, but never got to have because we were too busy taking care of everyone else." The 7 a.m. bus to Bay Ridge would arrive in 20 minutes. Carmen and I walked to the bus stop together, two elderly women carrying purses and dignity, leaving behind an expensive house that had never been a home for me. When the bus pulled up, the driver was a woman about my age, with kind eyes and silver hair, pinned back with bobby pins that reminded me of my own mother. She looked at me with the gentle recognition that passes between women who have survived long enough to understand that kindness is a choice you make every day, not a feeling that comes naturally. "Good morning, ladies," she said. "Where are you heading this beautiful day?" "Home," I answered, stepping onto the bus with Carmen behind me. "We're going home." As the bus pulled away from the curb, I didn't look back at the building where I had spent 2 unhappy years trying to earn love from people who saw me as a burden. I looked forward, toward Brooklyn, toward the small apartment that would smell like my own coffee and echo with my own thoughts, toward the beginning of the rest of my life. The driver caught my eye in the rearview mirror as we approached my stop. "Exit quietly, ma'am," she said softly. And something in her voice told me she understood that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is leave so quietly that the people who took you for granted don't realize you're gone until the work stops getting done and the money stops flowing, and the love they never appreciated is suddenly, irrevocably absent. I exited quietly, just as she suggested, and that quiet exit was the first step toward the loudest, most joyful year of my life. The furnished apartment in Bay Ridge was small, a 1-bedroom with a kitchenette and a view of the bridge if you stood on a chair and craned your neck just right. But it was mine. The keys worked when I tried them. No one could change the locks without my permission. No one could sell it out from under me. No one could make me feel grateful for the privilege of existing in space I was paying for. Carmen helped me settle in, bringing homemade soup and practical advice about living alone at our age. We established routines that felt revolutionary after 2 years of living on other people's schedules. Coffee at my kitchen table, not rushed before someone else needed something from me. Afternoon walks through Sunset Park, not errands for other people's needs. Evening phone calls with friends I was finally ready to reconnect with, not television programs I was expected to watch quietly in the corner. But the most radical thing I did was nothing at all. For the first week, I didn't call Sarah or Michael. I didn't text to check on Emma or the twins. I didn't offer to help with anything, solve any problems, provide any solutions. I simply existed in my own space, taking care of my own needs, paying attention to my own thoughts and feelings for the first time in decades. The silence from their end was deafening, not because they were worried about me, but because they hadn't noticed I was gone. The woman who had been central to their daily functioning for years had disappeared, and it took them 5 days to realize it. When Michael finally called, his voice was irritated rather than concerned. "Mom, where are you? Sarah said you weren't at the house when she got home from work yesterday." "I'm in my apartment," I said calmly. "What apartment? What are you talking about?" "The apartment I rented after you and Sarah locked me out and left me a note saying I wasn't welcome anymore." There was a pause. Then, "Mom, that's not what happened. We just thought you needed some space to figure things out." "I have figured things out," I said. "I figured out that I don't need to pay rent to people who treat me like an unwelcome guest." He launched into explanations and justifications. Words like, misunderstanding, and temporary solution, and what's best for everyone. But I had learned to listen to actions instead of words, and their actions had been clear and consistent. I was a burden they were trying to manage, not a mother they were trying to love. Sarah's response was more direct and more cutting. She came to my apartment unannounced on a Saturday morning, dressed in her expensive workout clothes, carrying a latte that cost more than I spent on food in a day. "Mom, this is ridiculous," she said, looking around my small apartment with unconcealed disdain. "You can't live like this. You're 72 years old. You need family around you." "I need respect around me," I replied. "Family is optional." She sat on my secondhand couch and tried a different approach, the one she used in court when she needed to convince someone to see things her way. "Look, I know things have been tense lately. David and I have been under a lot of pressure at work. Emma's been going through typical teenage stuff, and I know I haven't been as attentive as I should have been. But we can work this out. You don't need to prove a point by living in some tiny apartment in Brooklyn." "I'm not proving a point," I said. "I'm living a life." That's when she tried the approach that had always worked before. Make me feel guilty for putting my own needs first. What am I supposed to tell Emma? That her grandmother abandoned her? What am I supposed to tell people when they ask about you? That you chose to live alone in Brooklyn instead of with family who loves you? I looked at this woman I had raised, fed, clothed, educated, supported, sacrificed everything for, and I saw a stranger. A successful, accomplished, articulate stranger who had learned how to use love as a weapon and guilt as a tool of control. "Sarah," I said quietly, "when was the last time you told me you loved me without needing something from me first?" She stared at me, and I could see her trying to remember, searching through recent conversations for evidence of unconditional affection. The fact that she had to search was the answer. "That's what I thought," I continued. "You can tell Emma that her grandmother chose herself for the first time in 40 years. You can tell people whatever story makes you comfortable, but I won't be available to make your lives easier anymore. If you want a relationship with me, it will be on equal terms, with mutual respect and genuine affection. If you want someone to take care of your responsibilities and subsidize your expenses, you'll need to hire someone. I'm retired from being your solution to problems you should solve yourselves." She left angry, and I knew she would try other approaches. They both would. Because people who are used to getting their needs met at someone else's expense don't give up easily. They would try manipulation, guilt, promises, threats. But I had finally learned the most important lesson of my life. You teach people how to treat you by what you're willing to accept. I was no longer willing to accept being treated as anyone's afterthought. The weeks that followed were harder than I had expected. Not because of practical challenges, but because of emotional ones. Choosing yourself after a lifetime of choosing everyone else feels selfish, even when it's necessary. There were nights when I questioned my decision, when the silence of my phone made me wonder if I had been too harsh, too unforgiving, too demanding. But then I would remember the changed locks, the forged documents, the years of feeling invisible in rooms full of people I had sacrificed everything to love. The bills I couldn't pay because I was subsidizing their comfortable lives. The medical appointments I attended alone while they were too busy to care whether I lived or died. And I would remember Harold, who had worked himself to death believing that providing for family was the same as being loved by family, who had never lived to see the retirement we had planned, the trips we had dreamed about, the quiet years of enjoyment we had earned through decades of selfless service to children who saw our sacrifices as obligations rather than gifts. I started going to a grief counseling group at the community center, not just for Harold, but for grieving the family I had thought I had and the mother I had thought I was. Dr. Rodriguez, the social worker who facilitated the group, helped me understand that it's possible to love people deeply while also protecting yourself from their capacity to hurt you. "Love," she said during one of our sessions, "is not a debt you pay with your dignity. Love is not something you earn by making yourself smaller. Love is not something you prove by accepting treatment you wouldn't tolerate from strangers." The other women in the group, because we were mostly women, mostly mothers who had given too much for too long to children who had learned to take rather than appreciate, shared stories that made my own experience feel less isolated and more universal. Margaret, whose son had stolen her house through a reverse mortgage scam. Rosa, whose daughter used her grandchildren as weapons, allowing visits only when she needed babysitting or money. Jennifer, whose entire retirement fund had been borrowed for her son's business ventures that never materialized. We were all women who had confused enabling with loving, sacrifice with devotion, service with relationship. We were all learning, at an age when we should have been enjoying the fruits of our labor, that starting over is not just possible but necessary when the alternative is disappearing entirely. Spring turned to summer, and my life began to fill with things I had forgotten I enjoyed. I joined a book club at the library. I started taking watercolor classes at the senior center. I planted herbs on my fire escape and discovered that basil I grew myself tasted better than any I had ever bought. I rekindled friendships with women I had lost touch with during the years when my children's needs took precedence over my own social life. Most importantly, I started traveling. Not expensive trips, I was still careful with money, still rebuilding my financial security, but day trips on the subway to museums I had never had time to visit, weekend bus trips to small towns in upstate New York, week-long adventures to places I had dreamed about when I was young, but had never prioritized when I was busy raising children and supporting Harold's work. It was on one of these trips, a 4-day excursion to the Outer Banks of North Carolina, that I fell in love with the idea of living by the ocean. I had never seen beaches like these. Wide expanses of sand stretching to horizons that seemed infinite, waves that whispered instead of crashed, sunsets that painted the sky in colors I had never imagined possible. I stayed in a small bed and breakfast run by a couple in their 70s who had retired there from Philadelphia 15 years earlier. Over breakfast, they told me about the community of retirees who had found peace and purpose in this quiet corner of the world, far from the noise and expense and relentless pace of city life. "We came here for a weekend," the woman Patricia told me. "We never left. Best decision we ever made." I spent hours walking on the beach, talking to Harold the way I sometimes did when I needed his guidance. Harold, who had loved the ocean but had never had time to enjoy it, because he was always working to pay for other people's dreams. Harold, who would have loved the quiet mornings and peaceful evenings and the sense of living in harmony with nature instead of fighting against urban chaos. On the last day of my trip, I walked past a small cottage with a for sale sign in the front yard. It was painted pale blue with white shutters, surrounded by seagrass and wild roses, with a front porch that faced the ocean and windows that seemed to invite sunlight inside. I stood there for a long time, imagining what it would feel like to wake up every morning to the sound of waves instead of sirens. When I got back to Brooklyn, I couldn't stop thinking about that cottage. I called the realtor and learned that it was priced at $275,000. More money than I had ever spent on anything, more than Harold and I had paid for every place we had ever lived combined. But it was also less expensive than what I would spend on rent over the next 10 years, and it offered something no rental apartment could, a life that belonged entirely to me. I spent weeks researching the area, the housing market, the practical realities of relocating at my age. I talked to other retirees who had made similar moves. I calculated budgets and explored financing options and tried to talk myself out of what seemed like an impossible dream. But the more I learned, the more possible it seemed. North Carolina had a lower cost of living than New York. The community was welcoming to retirees. Healthcare was accessible and affordable. The cottage itself was in good condition, recently updated, ready to become home to someone who would appreciate its quiet beauty. Most importantly, I realized that I had spent so many years being practical and responsible and sacrificial that I had forgotten what it felt like to want something just for myself, not because it made financial sense or because it served someone else's needs, but because it made me happy to imagine living there. 3 months after my trip to the Outer Banks, I made an offer on the cottage. It was accepted the same day. 6 weeks later, I signed papers that made me the owner of a beach house in North Carolina. A sentence I never thought I would say about my own life. The day I left Brooklyn, Carmen threw me a goodbye party at her apartment. The guest list was small but meaningful. The women from my grief counseling group, my watercolor teacher, The librarian who had helped me discover authors I had never had time to read when I was busy managing other people's lives. We ate Carmen's empanadas and my homemade cookies and toasted with wine that tasted like celebration instead of consolation. I hadn't heard from Sarah or Michael in over a month. The silence had been deliberate on my part. I had stopped responding to their occasional texts asking for money or help or solutions to problems they should solve themselves. I had learned that every response, even a no, was an invitation for further negotiation, further manipulation, further attempts to draw me back into patterns that had nearly erased me entirely. But as I prepared to leave New York, I decided to write them each a letter. Not because I expected it to change anything, but because I needed to say goodbye to the mother I had been and the relationships that had defined me for so long. The letters were short and simple. I told them that I loved them and always would, but that I could no longer be available to solve their problems or subsidize their choices. I told them that I was starting a new life that prioritized my own well-being and happiness. I told them that if they ever wanted to rebuild our relationship on terms of mutual respect and genuine affection, they could find me at my new address, which I included at the bottom of each letter. I mailed the letters on my last day in New York and drove south toward North Carolina in a used Honda Civic I had bought with my own money, filled with belongings I had chosen to keep because they brought me joy, not because they served someone else's needs. The drive took 2 days, and I stopped frequently to notice things I had never had time to notice when travel was about getting somewhere efficiently rather than experiencing the journey itself. I had lunch at a small diner in Virginia where the waitress called me honey and meant it. I spent the night at a motel that was clean and quiet and anonymous in the best possible way. I bought postcards for Carmen and took pictures of landscapes that looked nothing like the urban environments where I had spent most of my adult life. When I finally arrived at my cottage, my home, my sanctuary, it was late afternoon, and the light was golden and warm. I sat on the front porch with a cup of coffee from the thermos I had packed, listening to waves and watching seabirds, and felt something I had forgotten was possible: pure, uncomplicated contentment. That night, I called Carmen to let her know I had arrived safely. "How does it feel, mija?" she asked. I looked around the small living room with its pale walls and polished wood floors and windows that showed me sky and water instead of brick and concrete. "It feels like home," I said. "It feels like the life Harold and I should have had together, and now I get to have it for both of us." The first months in North Carolina were adjustment and discovery. I learned the rhythms of a small coastal town, where people made eye contact when they passed on the street, and remembered your name after one conversation. I found a new doctor who spent time with me instead of rushing through appointments. I discovered a farmer's market where I could buy vegetables and flowers from people who had grown them with their own hands. I joined a church, not because I had become especially religious, but because the congregation was warm and welcoming, and gave me opportunities to contribute skills I had developed over a lifetime of service. I helped with the community garden and the monthly dinner for seniors, and the holiday programs for children whose families couldn't afford gifts. But these activities felt different from the service I had provided for my own family. They were appreciated, acknowledged, reciprocal. I was giving from abundance rather than depletion, from choice rather than obligation. I also started painting seriously for the first time since I was young. The watercolor classes I had taken in Brooklyn had awakened an interest I had abandoned when I got married and prioritized Harold's dreams, and then our children's needs over my own creative impulses. In North Carolina, I set up an easel on my back porch and spent mornings painting seascapes and sunrises and the everyday beauty of coastal life. My paintings weren't professional quality, but they were mine. Expressions of how it felt to live in a place that matched my internal landscape of peace and possibility. I gave them to new friends, donated them to church fundraisers, hung them on my own walls where they reminded me daily that I was a person with interests and talents beyond my capacity to solve other people's problems. 6 months after I moved to North Carolina, I received an unexpected phone call from Emma, my granddaughter. She had found my letters to Sarah and Michael, and she had questions. "Grandma," she said, her voice uncertain, "I don't understand what happened. Mom won't really explain, and Dad just says you decided you wanted to live somewhere else. But I miss you. I miss talking to you." It was the first time in years that someone in my family had expressed missing my presence rather than my services. I nearly cried. "I miss you too, sweetheart," I said. "I miss you very much. Can I come visit you? For like a weekend or something? I graduate high school next month, and I'm supposed to spend the summer working at Mom's office. But I'd rather see you and the ocean." That conversation led to Emma's first visit to my cottage. A long weekend in June that revealed a young woman I had never had the opportunity to know, when we were both trapped in the dynamics of her parents' household. Away from the pressures of her overscheduled life in Westchester, Emma was curious, thoughtful, genuine. She asked questions about Harold, about my childhood, about decisions I had made and dreams I had abandoned and choices I wished I could make differently if I had understood then what I understood now. We walked on the beach and painted watercolors and cooked simple meals together. She helped me plant a garden behind the cottage and taught me how to use smartphone apps I had been too intimidated to explore on my own. Most importantly, she talked to me like I was a person worth knowing, not just a grandmother who existed to serve her family's needs. On her last night, as we sat on the porch watching sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, Emma asked the question I had been expecting. "Why did you leave us, Grandma?" I thought carefully about how to answer honestly, without unfairly influencing her relationship with her parents. "I didn't leave you, Emma. I left a situation that was making me disappear. There's a difference." "What do you mean?" I pointed to the ocean in front of us, vast and endless under the evening sky. I used to live my life like I was a small pond, existing to reflect other people's needs and dreams. But I was meant to be part of something bigger. I was meant to be ocean. She was quiet for a long time, watching waves roll in and recede, each one different but all part of the same eternal rhythm. Then she said, "I think I understand. I think maybe I've been living like a pond, too." That weekend with Emma changed something between us. She started calling weekly, not because she needed anything, but because she enjoyed our conversations. She sent me pictures from college visits and asked my advice about decisions that had nothing to do with how they would affect her parents. For the first time, I had a relationship with one of my grandchildren that was based on genuine connection rather than duty or expectation. Her visits became regular. School breaks, summer weekends, times when she needed space to think about her future without the pressure of her parents' ambitions and expectations. Through her, I learned that my quiet exit from their lives had created changes I hadn't expected. Sarah had hired a housekeeper and a personal assistant to manage the tasks I had been doing for free. The cost was significant enough that she and David were reevaluating their lifestyle and spending habits in ways that were overdue but uncomfortable. Michael had been forced to find conventional financing for his business ventures instead of relying on family bailouts, which meant developing actual business plans and operating with financial accountability he had never learned. More importantly, my absence had forced them to confront the reality that they had been taking me for granted in ways that went far beyond money and domestic help. Emma told me that Sarah occasionally expressed regret about how things had ended between us, though she had never attempted to contact me directly. Michael had asked Emma for my phone number several times, but had never actually called. I realized that they were waiting for me to reach out first, to make the effort to repair relationships I hadn't broken. They expected me to miss being needed more than I valued being respected. They were wrong. A year after moving to North Carolina, I received news that would test my resolve and clarify my priorities in ways I hadn't anticipated. Carmen called to tell me that Sarah had been asking mutual friends for my phone number and address. According to the neighborhood gossip network, Sarah and David were getting divorced. Emma was struggling with anxiety about college, and Michael's latest business venture had failed spectacularly, leaving him deeply in debt. Part of me, the mother who had spent decades as their emotional and financial safety net, felt a familiar pull to return, to help, to sacrifice my own newfound peace to solve problems that weren't mine to solve. But I had learned to recognize the difference between love and enabling, between helping and allowing myself to be exploited. I wrote another letter, this one addressed to all of them. I expressed sympathy for their struggles and reaffirmed my love for them as people, regardless of how I felt about their choices. But I also made clear that I was not available to provide financial assistance, emotional management, or practical solutions to problems that were consequences of their own decisions. I offered something different: genuine relationship on terms of mutual respect. I invited them to visit me in North Carolina, to meet me as the person I had become, rather than expecting me to resume being the person I had been when everything revolved around their needs. I offered to listen without being expected to fix, to love without being expected to subsidize, to be a mother and grandmother without being a servant or a bank account. The responses were revealing. Michael never replied directly, though Emma told me he had described my letter as selfish and unrealistic. Sarah sent a brief text saying she was disappointed, but not surprised by my attitude. Only Emma understood that I was offering them more than they had ever given me, real relationship instead of transactional dependency. But their rejection of my terms for rebuilding our relationship didn't devastate me the way it would have a year earlier. I had learned that my worth wasn't determined by their approval or their need for my services. I had built a life that felt meaningful and joyful without revolving around their problems and demands. 2 years into my North Carolina life, something unexpected happened. I fell in love. Not romantically. Harold would always be the great love of my life, and I had no interest in replacing what we had shared. But I fell in love with myself, with the woman I had become when I stopped trying to earn approval and started living authentically. I fell in love with the way it felt to wake up every morning, knowing that the day ahead belonged to me, that I could fill it with activities and people and experiences that brought me joy rather than obligation. I fell in love with the sound of waves outside my bedroom window, and the sight of sunrise over the ocean, and the feeling of sand between my toes during my daily walks on the beach. I fell in love with the friendships I had built with other women who had also chosen themselves after decades of choosing everyone else first. Patricia and Robert from the bed and breakfast became surrogate family, along with Gloria, who had retired here from Atlanta after nursing her husband through Alzheimer's, and Margaret, who had moved here after her children made it clear they were too busy for regular contact, but not too busy to expect regular financial support. We were all women who had learned that loneliness in good company is better than companionship that requires you to disappear. We traveled together on bus trips to other coastal towns, had weekly dinners that rotated between our homes, celebrated birthdays and holidays, with the kind of genuine warmth I had been starving for during the years when I was surrounded by family who saw me as furniture rather than a person. I fell in love with painting and reading and gardening and all the small daily pleasures I had abandoned when I convinced myself that other people's happiness was more important than my own. I fell in love with having opinions about books and movies and politics without having to consider how my views might inconvenience someone else's expectations. Most of all, I fell in love with the radical act of living for myself, not selfishly. I volunteered regularly and maintained friendships and contributed to my community. But I lived with the understanding that my first responsibility was to treat myself with the kindness and respect I had spent 70 years giving away to people who had never learned to appreciate it. 3 years after leaving New York, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible to the woman who used to sit on the steps of a Brooklyn apartment building, locked out of her own home by children who had never learned that love is not something you take, but something you share. I decided to sell my cottage and buy a larger house, still by the ocean, but with enough space to host Emma for extended visits, to have friends for dinner parties, to create an art studio where I could paint without worrying about space or light or interruption. The cottage had appreciated significantly in value since I bought it, and combined with continued careful management of Harold's forgotten investments and my own modest savings, I had enough money to buy something I had never imagined owning, a real beach house, the kind of place Harold and I used to walk past during our rare vacations, wondering what it would feel like to live with ocean views and space for guests and gardens. The house I fell in love with was a 2-story Victorian that had been lovingly restored by a couple who was relocating to be closer to their grandchildren. It had wide porches with ocean views, 4 bedrooms, a sunny kitchen with space for the large table Harold and I had always dreamed of having when we had room to entertain, and a separate studio space that had been used by the previous owners for pottery but would be perfect for painting. At $1.8 million, it was more expensive than any purchase I had ever contemplated. It was also the first major decision I had made in my adult life, based purely on what would make me happy, rather than what would be practical or responsible or serve someone else's needs. I made an offer that was accepted within hours. 6 months later, I moved from my small cottage to a house that represented everything I had never dared to want for myself. The day I signed the final papers, making me the owner of a beach house worth nearly $2 million, I called Carmen to share the news. She laughed with delight and asked the question I had been asking myself. Mija, do you ever think about what your children would say if they knew? I looked around the spacious living room with its hardwood floors and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, and I realized something profound. I didn't care what they would say. Their opinions about my choices no longer held power over my decisions or my happiness. I had finally, completely, learned to live my own life. Emma was my first houseguest in the new place, staying for 2 weeks between finishing high school and starting college. She was amazed by the transformation in both my living situation and my confidence. "Grandma," she said one morning as we shared coffee on the front porch, watching dolphins play in the waves, "you seem like a completely different person." "I'm the same person," I replied. "I just finally have room to be all of myself instead of just the parts other people needed." She was quiet for a moment, then surprised me with her next question. "Do you ever regret leaving? Do you ever miss being closer to family?" It was a fair question, and I gave it the consideration it deserved. "I miss the family I thought I had," I said finally. "I miss the idea of children who valued my presence as much as they needed my service. But I don't miss feeling invisible in my own life. I don't miss being treated like a burden by people I sacrificed everything to love. And I don't regret choosing dignity over dependency." "Mom still talks about you sometimes," Emma said softly. "She says she wishes things had been different." "Wishing things were different is not the same as being willing to do the work to make them different," I replied. "Your mother has my address and my phone number. If she wanted a relationship based on mutual respect rather than my availability to solve her problems, she could have that. The choice has always been hers." That evening, Emma helped me hang my paintings throughout the new house. My watercolors of seascapes and sunrises, beach grasses and seabirds, filled rooms that had previously felt too large and formal. Seeing my own artistic expression displayed in a home I owned completely transformed both the space and my understanding of my right to create beauty for my own sake. As we worked together, Emma shared news I hadn't asked for but was curious to hear. Sarah's divorce had been expensive and emotionally devastating, partly because David had hidden assets and partly because her focus on career advancement had left her unprepared for the practical realities of single motherhood. She was working longer hours than ever, struggling to manage household responsibilities she had previously delegated to me, and dealing with Emma's anxiety about college without the support system she had taken for granted when I was available to provide stability and wisdom. Michael's pattern of failed business ventures had finally caught up with him. His wife Jennifer had left him, taking their sons and most of their joint assets. He was living in a studio apartment and working for someone else's company for the first time in his adult life, learning what financial accountability felt like when there was no family safety net to cushion poor decisions. I felt sadness for their struggles, the kind of compassion you can have for anyone facing difficult circumstances. But I also felt a clarity I had never experienced before. Their problems were consequences of choices they had made repeatedly, despite opportunities to choose differently. I was not responsible for rescuing them from realities they had created for themselves. More importantly, I understood that even if I still lived in their daily orbit, my attempts to help would only enable them to continue avoiding the life lessons they needed to learn. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for people is refuse to protect them from the consequences of their own actions. On Emma's last night of that visit, she asked if she could invite her mother to visit sometime. "I think she might be ready to have a different kind of relationship with you," she said. "She's been through a lot, and I think she's starting to understand some things differently." I considered the request carefully. "Emma, you're always welcome here, and anyone you want to bring with you is welcome too. But I won't participate in conversations about money. I won't be asked to solve problems I didn't create. And I won't be expected to pretend that what happened between us was a misunderstanding rather than a pattern of exploitation that continued for years. If your mother can accept those boundaries, I would be happy to see her. If she can't, then it's better that she doesn't come." Emma nodded thoughtfully. I think I understand. You're not saying you don't love her. You're saying you love yourself too. Exactly. 4 years after my quiet exit from their lives, Sarah finally came to visit. She arrived on a Friday afternoon in October, driving a rental car from the Norfolk airport, looking older and more fragile than I remembered, but also somehow more authentic, as if difficult experiences had worn away some of the polished facade she had maintained for so many years. The first few hours were awkward, both of us navigating conversation without the familiar patterns of her needing something and me providing it. We talked about safe topics: the house, the weather, Emma's college experience, mutual acquaintances from New York. But underneath the pleasant surface conversation, I could feel her struggling with how to relate to me as an equal rather than as a resource. On her second day, as we walked on the beach after breakfast, she finally said what she had come to say. Mom, I owe you an apology. Multiple apologies, actually. I've been thinking a lot about how we treated you, especially in those last years before you left. And I'm ashamed of the way I acted. I listened without responding, having learned that people often need space to express remorse completely before they're ready to hear anything in return. I was so focused on managing my own stress and responsibilities that I stopped seeing you as a person with your own needs and feelings. She continued, I treated you like a service I was entitled to instead of a mother who deserved love and respect. I'm sorry. I'm really, truly sorry. Her apology felt genuine, and I appreciated the courage it had taken for her to travel here and express it directly. But I also knew that apologies without changed behavior are just words, and I had learned not to be satisfied with words when I needed actions. I accept your apology, I said. Thank you for making the effort to express it in person. We walked in silence for several minutes, her waiting for me to say more, me comfortable with the quiet while I considered how much of my own truth I was ready to share. Finally, she asked the question I had been expecting. Is there any chance we could start over? Build something different between us? I stopped walking and turned to face her, this accomplished woman who was still my daughter, despite everything that had happened between us. Sarah, do you remember what you said to me when I asked when you had last told me you loved me without needing something from me first? She looked uncomfortable but nodded. You couldn't remember, I continued, and neither could I. For years, I thought love meant making myself available for whatever you needed, even when it came at the cost of my own well-being. You thought love meant having someone available to solve your problems and support your choices without question. We were both wrong. I gestured to the ocean in front of us, vast and beautiful under the afternoon sun. I've learned to love differently. I love you enough to want you to be happy, but not enough to sacrifice my own happiness to make that possible. I love you enough to wish you well, but not enough to subsidize choices that aren't good for you. I love you enough to maintain relationship, but only if it's based on mutual respect rather than my availability to serve your needs. She was crying now, tears that seemed to come from a deep place of recognition and regret. I understand, she whispered. I think I'm finally starting to understand. The rest of her visit was different. Instead of expecting me to manage her emotions or solve her problems, she listened to my stories about the life I had built in North Carolina. She admired my paintings with genuine interest rather than polite obligaton. She helped with dinner preparation and cleanup without being asked. She respected my routines and boundaries without testing them or trying to negotiate exceptions. Most importantly, she began to share her own authentic struggles and feelings, instead of presenting herself as competent and in control, while expecting me to provide stability and support. For the first time in years, we had conversations that felt reciprocal rather than transactional. When she left, she hugged me with real warmth and said, I'd like to visit again, if you'd be open to that. Not because I need anything, but because I want to know the woman you've become. I want to know my mother as a person, not just as someone who exists to take care of other people. I would like that too, I said. And I meant it. 6 months later, Michael called. His conversation was different from Sarah's, less articulate about emotions, more focused on practical realities, but ultimately containing a similar recognition that he had taken advantage of my generosity and love in ways that were unfair and unsustainable. Mom, he said, I've been living paycheck to paycheck for the first time in my adult life, and I finally understand how hard it must have been for you and Dad when we were growing up. I also understand how wrong it was for me to keep asking you for money when I should have been learning to manage my own finances. Unlike Sarah, Michael didn't ask to visit. He asked for something more valuable: permission to start over with phone calls and letters, to slowly rebuild trust and connection without the pressure of face-to-face interaction until we had established new patterns of relating to each other. "I know I don't have the right to expect forgiveness," he said, "but I'm hoping you might be willing to give me a chance to prove that I can be a better son than I was when I thought you would always be available to clean up my mistakes." Those phone calls became monthly, then bi-weekly, then weekly conversations that covered everything from his experiences learning financial responsibility to my adventures in painting to shared memories of Harold that we could finally discuss without the conversation becoming about what Michael needed from me. A year later, he visited with his sons. My grandsons, who had become teenagers I barely knew during the years when family interaction was filtered through their parents' expectations and needs. Tyler and Trevor, now 15, were polite but curious about the grandmother they remembered as someone who gave good hugs and made good cookies, but had disappeared from their lives without explanation. During their long weekend visit, I learned that they were thoughtful, intelligent young men who were interested in art and nature and ideas in ways their parents had never encouraged, when the focus was on managing schedules and expenses rather than nurturing relationships. Away from the pressures of their urban lives, they relaxed into genuine conversation and exploration. We spent time on the beach and in my art studio, where I taught them basic watercolor techniques, and they taught me about photography and music and books they were reading in school. For the first time, I had a relationship with my grandsons that was based on mutual interest and affection rather than my role as convenient childcare. When they left, Tyler surprised me by asking if he could come back for a week during summer vacation. "Not to hang out at the beach," he clarified. "I mean, that would be cool too, but I want to learn more about painting, and I want to hear more stories about Grandpa Harold." That summer visit became the beginning of a real relationship with my grandsons, one that developed independently of their father's evolution and their mother's continued distance. They were old enough to maintain contact through texts and video calls, to express their own opinions about family dynamics, to choose connection with me based on their own feelings rather than their parents' convenience. 5 years after my quiet exit from Brooklyn, I was living a life I couldn't have imagined when I was sitting on those cold concrete steps, locked out of the home I had helped buy and maintain for decades. I owned a beautiful house by the ocean. I had friendships based on genuine mutual affection. I had creative pursuits that brought me joy and a sense of accomplishment. I had relationships with Emma and the twins that were authentic and warm. Most importantly, I had learned to value myself enough to require respect from others. I had learned that setting boundaries is an act of love, both for yourself and for people who need to learn how to treat others with dignity. I had learned that sometimes the most generous thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's irresponsibility or selfishness. I had also learned that starting over is possible at any age, that it's never too late to choose yourself, that dignity and peace are worth more than approval from people who only value you for what you can provide. But the most profound lesson I learned was about the difference between being alone and being lonely. I had spent years surrounded by family members who made me feel invisible and unimportant. Now I spent most of my time by myself or with friends who saw me as a complete person, and I rarely felt lonely. I had learned that the quality of connection matters more than the quantity. That authentic relationship with a few people who truly care about you is infinitely better than superficial relationships with many people who only care about what you can do for them. On a beautiful morning in May, exactly 5 years after I had boarded that 7 a.m. bus and taken the first step toward reclaiming my life, I sat on my front porch with coffee and the newspaper, watching waves roll in under a sky painted in shades of blue I had never noticed during the years when I was too busy serving other people's needs to pay attention to beauty that existed just for its own sake. My phone rang, and I saw Sarah's name on the caller display. This had become a weekly tradition. Conversations that were sometimes about practical matters, sometimes about our shared memories of Harold, sometimes about books we were both reading, or experiences she was having as she learned to prioritize relationship over achievement. "Good morning, Mom," she said, and her voice carried warmth that had been missing for years before I made the decision to leave New York. "Good morning, sweetheart," I replied. "How are you today?" We talked for 30 minutes about Emma's college experiences, about Sarah's gradual recovery from her divorce, about my latest painting project, and her attempts to establish better work-life balance. It was the kind of conversation I had dreamed of having with my daughter when she was young. Mutual, respectful, genuinely interested in each other's lives and well-being. When we hung up, I sat quietly for a few minutes, grateful for the relationship we had rebuilt, and amazed by how different it felt to be loved for who I was rather than what I could provide. Later that morning, Carmen called from Brooklyn. Now 78, she had been experiencing some health challenges and was considering her own move to a warmer climate where the winters wouldn't be so hard on her arthritic joints. We had remained close friends throughout my transition to North Carolina, and she had visited several times, falling in love with the peace and beauty of coastal living. "Mija," she said, "I've been thinking about our conversation last weekend, about that little cottage that's for sale 3 blocks from your house. Do you really think an old woman like me could start over somewhere new?" I laughed, remembering my own fears about relocating at 72. "Carmen, I think old women like us are exactly the ones who should start over somewhere new. We've spent enough time accommodating other people's expectations. It's time to live for ourselves." 6 months later, Carmen moved to North Carolina and bought the cottage we had looked at together. Having my dearest friend living close by added another layer of joy to a life that was already richer than I had ever dared to hope for. That autumn, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible during the years when I measured my worth by how much I was needed by others. I decided to throw a party, not to celebrate someone else's achievement or milestone, but simply to celebrate the fact that I had created a life worth celebrating. I invited everyone who had become important to me in my new life. Carmen, of course, and Patricia and Robert from the bed and breakfast, and Gloria and Margaret and several other friends from church and art class and the community garden. I invited Emma, who was home from college for fall break, and Tyler and Trevor, who convinced Michael to let them take a long weekend to visit their grandmother, who had finally learned to put herself first. I invited Sarah too, and to my surprise, she accepted and asked if she could bring David's replacement, a kind man named James, whom she had met in her divorce support group and was cautiously beginning to trust with her heart again. The party was simple but beautiful. A late afternoon gathering on my wide front porch and in my spacious living room, with food I enjoyed cooking instead of meals I prepared out of obligation. We watched the sunset over the ocean, shared stories and laughter, and celebrated the radical act of choosing joy over duty, dignity over enabling, authentic connection over superficial obligation. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Emma helped me clean up while Tyler and Trevor played music on their phones and danced with Carmen, who was teaching them salsa steps she had learned in her youth. Sarah and James sat on the porch swing, holding hands and talking quietly, looking more relaxed than I had seen Sarah in years. "Grandma," Emma said as we loaded dishes into the dishwasher, "this feels like what family is supposed to feel like." I looked around at the people who had filled my home with warmth and genuine affection. People who valued my presence for reasons that had nothing to do with what I could give them or do for them, and realized she was exactly right. "Yes," I said, "this is what family is supposed to feel like." That night, after everyone had left and the house was quiet again, I sat on my front porch with a glass of wine and thought about the woman I had been 5 years earlier, desperate for any scrap of attention or approval, willing to accept any treatment as long as it meant I wasn't alone, convinced that my only value lay in my capacity to serve others' needs. I thought about Harold and the retirement dreams we had shared, but never pursued, because we were too busy sacrificing for children who had learned to take our sacrifices for granted, rather than appreciate them as gifts. I thought about the years I had spent feeling invisible in rooms full of people who were supposed to love me, the birthdays that passed unnoticed, the illnesses I endured alone while providing support for everyone else's crises. I thought about the changed locks and the dismissive note that had finally forced me to confront the reality that I was being treated as disposable by people I had considered the most important relationships in my life. And I wondered what would have happened if I had never found the courage to walk away. If I had continued to accept being treated as a burden out of fear of being alone. But mostly, I felt profound gratitude for the series of small choices that had led me to this moment. The decision to board that morning bus after being locked out. The choice to rent my own apartment instead of begging to be taken back. The commitment to build new friendships instead of depending on family members who had proven they didn't value my well-being. The leap of faith involved in buying a cottage by the ocean and then trading it for this beach house that represented everything I had never dared to want for myself. I raised my glass to the ocean and to Harold's memory, and to the woman I had discovered myself to be when I finally stopped trying to earn love through service and started demanding respect through boundaries. The next morning, I woke up the way I had woken up every morning for 5 years, grateful to be living a life that belonged entirely to me, excited about the possibilities each new day offered, surrounded by beauty I had chosen and people who genuinely cared about my happiness. I made coffee in my sunny kitchen, checked on the herb garden I had planted outside the back door, and read emails from friends who were planning visits and activities and adventures that had nothing to do with solving problems or managing crises. Then I walked out to my art studio, the converted sunroom where morning light streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, and began work on a new painting. It was a seascape, like most of my work, but this one was different. Instead of depicting the ocean as calm and peaceful, I was painting it in motion. Waves crashing against rocks, water reshaping the shoreline through persistent, patient power. As I mixed colors and considered brushstrokes, I realized I was painting a metaphor for my own transformation. Like the ocean, I had learned that persistence and patience could reshape even the most stubborn landscapes. Like the waves, I had discovered that gentle but consistent pressure could accomplish what dramatic gestures could not. I had become like the ocean itself, vast enough to contain multitudes, powerful enough to shape my own boundaries, deep enough to weather any storm, and beautiful enough to attract people who appreciated my depths rather than trying to drain them for their own purposes. At 77 years old, I was living the most authentic, joyful, purposeful life I had ever known. It had taken me 7 decades to learn that love is not something you earn through sacrifice. Respect is not something you negotiate through service, and happiness is not something you find by making yourself smaller so others can feel bigger. I had learned that the most radical act a woman can perform is to value herself enough to require others to value her as well. I had learned that setting boundaries is not selfish but necessary, that choosing your own well-being is not cruel but kind, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable their capacity to treat you poorly. Most importantly, I had learned that it's never too late to start over, never too late to choose differently, never too late to claim the life you were meant to live instead of the life others expected you to settle for. As I painted that morning, adding layers of color and texture that would transform blank canvas into something beautiful and meaningful, I thought about all the women my age who might still be sitting on cold concrete steps, locked out of homes they had helped build, wondering if they have any choice but to accept whatever treatment they're offered rather than risk being alone. I wanted them to know what I had learned, that being alone with dignity is infinitely better than being surrounded by people who make you feel invisible. That financial security based on your own choices is more valuable than financial dependence on others' generosity. That friendships built on mutual respect are more sustaining than family relationships based on obligation and guilt. I wanted them to know that at 72, or 75, or 80, or any age, they could still board a morning bus that would take them away from situations that diminish them and toward lives that celebrate them, that they could still discover talents they had abandoned, develop friendships they had never prioritized, explore dreams they had deferred for decades while serving everyone else's needs. I wanted them to know that quiet exits can lead to loud, joyful lives, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is leave so calmly that the people who took you for granted don't realize you're gone until the work stops getting done and the money stops flowing, and the love they never appreciated is suddenly, permanently unavailable. But mostly, I wanted them to know that love, real love, authentic love, healthy love, never requires you to disappear. Real love sees you clearly, values you completely, and treats you with the respect and kindness you deserve simply because you exist, not because of what you can provide. And if the people in your life can't offer you that kind of love, then you owe it to yourself to find people who can, even if it means starting over in your 70s with nothing but hope and determination and the radical belief that you deserve better than what you've been accepting. As I put the final touches on my painting that morning, adding highlights that made the waves seem to move with life and power, I realized I had created something that pleased me completely, not because it would impress anyone else or serve anyone else's needs, but because it expressed something true about my own experience and because the process of creating it had brought me joy. I stepped back to admire my work, and in that moment, I understood something profound about the difference between my old life and my new one. For 72 years, I had been trying to create beauty and meaning and value for other people, measuring my success by their approval and satisfaction. Now, at 77, I was creating beauty and meaning and value for myself, measuring my success by my own sense of authenticity and fulfillment. It was, I realized, the difference between existing and living, between surviving and thriving, between accepting whatever love was offered and insisting on the kind of love that sees you for who you truly are and celebrates that person without reservation or condition. I cleaned my brushes and put away my paints, then walked out onto the front porch where I had spent so many mornings watching the sun rise over the Atlantic Ocean. The day was beautiful, clear and warm, with just enough breeze to make the seagrass dance. I could see dolphins playing in the waves, could hear seabirds calling to each other, could smell the salt air that had become as familiar and comforting as Harold's cologne on his old shirts. I sat in the rocking chair I had bought for this porch, opened a book I was reading purely for pleasure, and spent the next hour doing something I had hardly ever done when I was busy managing everyone else's lives. Absolutely nothing productive, nothing that served anyone else's needs, nothing that required me to be anywhere other than exactly where I was, doing exactly what I wanted to do. It was quite possibly the most revolutionary act of my entire life. As I finish telling you this story, I want you to know that I'm sitting on that same porch on a morning very much like the one I just described. The sun is painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Waves are whispering against the shore. And I'm about to start work on a new painting that exists for no reason other than because I want to create it. Tomorrow, Emma is driving down from college to spend her spring break with me. Next week, Tyler and Trevor are flying here for a long weekend. Next month, Sarah is bringing James for their third visit, and Michael is coming with his new girlfriend, a kind woman named Lisa, who understands that healthy relationships are built on mutual respect rather than one person's availability to solve all of the other person's problems. Carmen is planning a small dinner party for next Saturday, and we're all excited about trying new recipes and sharing stories and laughing until our faces hurt. My art teacher wants me to consider showing my paintings in a local gallery. Not because anyone is pressuring me to turn my hobby into a business, but because several people have expressed genuine appreciation for my work. I have a life filled with people who see me clearly, value me completely, and treat me with the respect I spent 70 years learning to require. I have a home that reflects my own tastes and priorities. I have friendships based on genuine mutual affection. I have creative pursuits that bring me joy and a sense of accomplishment. Most importantly, I have learned to love myself enough to insist that others love me well, and to walk away calmly when they prove they cannot or will not meet that reasonable expectation. 5 years ago, they locked me out of a house that had never really been my home. Today, I'm living in a house I bought with money they didn't know I had, surrounded by people who appreciate my presence rather than just my services, creating beauty for the sake of beauty and finding joy in the radical act of living authentically. The quiet exit I made that morning when the bus driver said, "Exit quietly, ma'am," led me to the loudest, most joyful life I have ever known. It bought me more than a beach house worth $2 million. It bought me the most precious thing anyone can own, a life that belongs entirely to myself. So here's what I want to ask you, and I hope you'll answer honestly, either in the comments or in the quiet of your own heart. Have you ever felt invisible in your own life? Have you ever wondered if the people who claim to love you actually see you as a person, or just as a source of solutions to their problems? Have you ever sat on cold steps, literally or metaphorically, wondering if you have any choice but to accept whatever treatment is offered rather than risk being alone? If any of this feels familiar, I want you to know that it's never too late to board your own morning bus toward a life that celebrates who you are instead of diminishing you. It's never too late to choose dignity over dependency, authentic connection over superficial obligation, peaceful solitude over chaotic company that makes you feel invisible. You deserve to be seen clearly, valued completely, and treated with respect and kindness. You deserve relationships that add to your life rather than drain it. You deserve to create beauty and meaning and joy for yourself, not just for others. And if the people in your life cannot or will not offer you that kind of love and respect, then you owe it to yourself to find people who can, even if it means starting over with nothing but hope and the revolutionary belief that you are worth more than what you've been accepting. If this story has touched something in you, if it has made you feel less alone in your own struggles, or given you hope that change is possible even when it seems impossible, would you please like this video and subscribe to help me reach others who might need to hear this message? Every share, every comment, every kind word you leave helps me continue opening my heart and hopefully helps someone else begin the journey toward choosing themselves. Because that's what this is really about. Not just my story, but all of our stories. All of the quiet revolutions that happen when women decide they're worth more than they've been accepting and brave enough to make whatever changes are necessary to create lives that honor their true value. Thank you for listening. Thank you for seeing me. And thank you for considering the possibility that you, too, deserve to be seen and valued and loved well. Now go and live the life you were meant to live, not the life others expect you to settle for. You're worth it. You've always been worth it. And it's never too late to start believing that about yourself.